Hello.
Howdy.
Howdy, howdy. Welcome to episode 3 of season 1 of the Well Society podcast. We've got another good friend on the show today. He is a friend of about, I think, around 12, 15 years now. Probably
No,
15,
more than that, right?
more than that.
You guys known each other for
Yeah,
like all your life.
for me, I think, yeah, I've known him since like, I don't know, like second grade. And Duma, yeah, probably a bit more than
Like
a few.
10. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Tharitha, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, guys. I'm very keen for this conversation.
Yeah, man, it was great to get
Awesome.
you.
And so I'm very keen because we're getting someone who actually know what they're talking about. Me and Dula, we don't really know what we're talking about. We just rant a lot. So it's good to get, someone who is knowledgeable about a lot of stuff.
I think we've set dangerously high expectations now. So
Oh,
It's okay. We need to give the people what they want. So let's do that. Yeah.
cool. I think today we don't really have a clear outline of what we are trying to target in this episode, but we're going to touch on a bunch of things, mainly around colonialism, I think, and how that's affected us, and sort of talk to Tharitha about his experience around it as well.
And his viewpoints, much like our viewpoints, and I guess opinions, which don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but it is a conversation after all. So, yeah, it'll be fun to listen to.
Yeah. What's the most common sort of question you get, Tharitha? I know because I guess for the listeners, so Tharitha is obviously Sri Lankan, but he lives in Sydney at the moment, has been living in Sydney for a while
Just
now.
just doxed him there, right? Just
Oh yeah.
out
Yeah.
of
What's your
nowhere.
address, Tharitha? Just let maybe say it. No, but what's kind of the first sort of thing people ask you when they talk to you?
I would say there are three questions, like one of three questions, I guess. The first one is how do you say your name? And like my name, to be fair, my name, to be fair, is even complicated by Sri Lankan standards. And then the second one is some people like just circumvent the first question about how do you say your name and just say, "Oh, do you have a nickname I can call you by?" Uh, which I think is a very funny one. And then the third question is usually after a couple of like sort of minutes of conversation, how do you speak English so well, or your English is so good, which is not a question but a statement. Yes, it's one of those three themes which are interesting, sort of first impressions, I guess.
Yeah, but your first name isn't that complicated at all. It's three syllables, and the syllables are very common syllables as well. Like
Yeah, no,
it's
and it's a very
Tharitha, yeah.
common name in the stem of the name is very common in Sri Lanka, right? So you have Tharitas, you have Haritas, Rakitas, and all
Yeah.
sorts of variations of that. So yeah.
Yeah, true. I mean, me and Dylan are same situation. Like those three questions are very common, and I don't know. I've just been really like recently been interested in that question right around my name, because that's kind of your whole identity, I think, and the fact that people kind of think it's okay to disregard that so easily is, I don't know, it's a bit weird, because I go to some of these classical music shows and all these composers, they have the craziest names, right? They're like Russian, and they take so much effort to pronounce it so correctly, like, and then my name has like three syllables. Like, surely you can just put a bit of effort, like.
Yeah, I guess the effort thing is what I see as well, right? Like if you're gonna converse with someone for more than one time, you should have the respect towards that person to get their name right. Like it is a very basic thing that people overlook, and I think it says something about that person. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Because I, I don't know, like people. I know my Chinese friends. They kind of have like a white name, right? Like a Christian name, like a anglicized version of their name that they use instead of their actual name, which is kind of sad to be honest. Because between themselves and in their family, they're obviously not using their name, but they sort of have to sort of switch. I think it's called code switching, where you kind of switch between that identity or version you present to, let's say, the white people, I guess, versus your own community. Um, I don't know. It's a weird one.
Which is something we do as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, hugely, right? Like, so if you ask people who I associate in majority white spaces, some people who are mostly white, but also like other people who I talk to at work, for example, or uni, they would say that I am a quite introverted person, which to the experience of everyone on this podcast, as well as all other people I know who are Sri Lankan, is very different to who I am. So I think there is a big difference in sort of, at least I personally notice or I'm aware of two different codes. And that's not necessarily something that I do deliberately. It's just a level of comfort I feel in those spaces, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. Like that's same thing, same scenario. Um, yeah, yeah. Same with Duma, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's so easy now that I can like switch between these two like versions of myself very fast. It's almost instantaneous. Like I could be talking to like a white friend of mine, and then I know my auntie could call me, and then I would just immediately just
Yeah.
switch. Like, and it's so easy. But then I don't have any issue with it at all. But I've just been thinking about it. And I think people should be more aware of the fact that it happens, and the person that the other person, the version of the person the other person's presenting to you is not the actual real version, I guess.
It's also something that like you don't, yeah, like Tharitha said, it's not something you do on purpose, right? Kind of like automatically switches on sometimes, and like you sort of you don't even feel it happening sometimes, and then after a certain moment, they it's almost like they know certain characteristics about you that you're not aware of, because you've been a whole different person towards them, but you know yourself you're not really that person, and then someone calls you, you're much more introverted, and then
Have you
yeah.
have you guys had that experience where with like resumes and job applications, like it's like as soon as they see your name, it's like you're not the first choice. I've had that experience where I wish I had like a English name so I could just use that as my first name, where because they see my name because my name's really long, my last name. It's like
Yeah.
you already know your chances just decreased immediately.
Yeah, I think it's something recruiters are trying to rectify, definitely. Um, through personal experience as well. Like they've been more accommodating towards that. They try to like they definitely like don't use that against you. But again, like
They try not to,
completely,
right?
yeah, they
They
try
try.
not to. But there is this like bias, like um secret bias in your head, perhaps because of that, and that's again like not a fault towards them, but it's like this thing that's been instilled inside them for throughout history, I guess.
Yeah, I mean everyone has unconscious bias, and
Yeah,
it's a product of everything that's happened to you, all your experiences through life. I think the objective is not to get rid of all your biases, but just to be aware of them and then be aware that they exist.
Yeah, there's pretty good research just around sort of resume screening and how people with ethnic names, let's call them, or non-Anglo-Saxon names, um, are far more disadvantaged in this entire process. Um, it's a very interesting one, and the place where I've probably seen it is not in resume screening personally, but like is in like networking conversations, because often you engage in these spaces which are like really loud, right? There are lots of people talking, lots of people trying to get attention and stuff like that. And then you go and one guy's like, my name's Tim, another guy's like John, James, whatever. And then you're like, oh, it's Tharitha. And then the third person, who's usually like an old white guy, has to ask you like 5 times what your name is. And you've already got off to this networking conversation on the wrong foot. Like, I just always feel like a bit self-aware. But I feel like personally, I'm of the stance that, like, as I said earlier, you should have the respect to sort of get someone's name right. Although that is a bit odd in the networking context, right? Because it's a bit of a weird situation, anyways. People trying to talk to each other for personal and professional gain. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, with like I don't know, when I go to a coffee shop or something
yeah.
and
I was
I'm
literally
getting a
about to bring that
coffee.
up.
Yeah, I'm like, I can't, I don't have the
Yeah.
energy to go through the experience for the 500th time today. So I'll just give you like, well, just some easy name for you to just write down. Um, but I don't know. I think it's it's like my name's not that hard. It's like it's 3 syllables. I think but all of our names are like 3 syllables, and they're not diphthongs, meaning they're not they're not sounds they can't produce. Like most Westerners can produce those sounds because they're in the English language, um, and it's just people not putting in the effort. I think, or thinking, or just being ignorant to the fact that it means so much to another person if they get their name right. And they also, I think, forget the fact that it also works in reverse, where I know like my parents can sometimes have a hard time trying to pronounce or getting English names right. Right. So if we put in the effort to get your name right, because it's your name is not easy for us as it is to you, and we put in the effort, and the whole community, all the communities that are not English, I guess, have put in that effort in. So I think people do need to be a bit more aware of it.
So the question to me is, are people putting the effort in on purpose, or have they been forced to put the effort in the past? And because of that, they are far more familiar with John, James, and Anne than they are with Tharitha, Dumidu, and Dulana.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Fair point.
it's like I was telling Duma about this like as well, um, where literally they say they say your name and they're like, "Am I getting this right? Am I pronouncing it right?" And you think like your initial feelings like it's almost like out of courtesy and like um compassionate almost, but then like then you're thinking like, are they saying that as a follow up or like are they saying that as a trying to deceive you to like make sure like you think that they're putting in the effort for it. Yeah.
I think I gotta be good with I get frustrated sometimes with that, but I think I need to be willing to help them, say my name properly, because it's honestly it can be hard because if you haven't heard that word before. So I think both sides need to be aware of it and sort of help each other, I think.
Yeah, especially because it's the same for both you and I. It's like the du letters in our name is not the same thing when it's converted. When you actually speak in Sinhalese, like it's do, not do. And like almost like unconsciously now I introduce myself as Dulana, not Dulana, which the latter is the correct version of it. And like I have become adjusted to it almost.
Yeah, I don't even respond to my full name. Like it's so weird. Like I don't identify myself with my first name. Like it's been like my full first name. I've been here so long that it's gone out of, I don't know. It's like it's not in my head anymore. Like I don't, when people call me, it feels weird. Like it doesn't feel like me. But maybe I think we're going down this rabbit hole of names for too long. Maybe I'll just bring it back to what sort of Tharitha was pointing out, the fact that have you been sort of conditioned and forced to sort of get used to sort of Western culture, right? Which brings us to colonialism in Sri Lanka.
So yeah, for all the listeners who don't know about the exact timeline and the factuals behind the colonization in Sri Lanka. So the Portuguese intervention happened in 1505, and that lasted Close to 90 years, I think, and it lasted to 1594, and then I think the Dutch captured Colombo in well, they first made a treaty in 1638, and then they captured Colombo in 1656. Um, and then after the invasion of the Portuguese and the Dutch, colonial Sri Lanka started. The British Ceylon period, where the British invaded the Kingdom of Kandy, which was the Kingdom of Sri Lanka at the time, in 1803. And then after a few back and forth and fighting back from the Sinhalese, 1815, I think, was when the independence of Sri Lanka was, well, at the time, fully uh, finished. And yeah, that was, I think, when like the Uwa rebellion was also suppressed. Uh, and yeah, by I think around the mid 19th century, it's basically Ceylon.
Yes, one.
Yeah.
And that's crazy because that's what more than 400 years of colonization, right?
Yep.
That's a long time. That's what, four generations, at least 5 generations of, like say, it's very ingrained in our culture. I mean, don't you have like a Portuguese name, Lula, like a middle name or something?
Yeah, well, my I don't. My dad was good enough to cut off like the Pereira part. But yeah, he does. I mean, my father's family has a Pereira part.
Yes, I
Yeah.
guess that's an interesting tidbit, right? So the most common name in Sri Lanka is Pereira from the Portuguese Pereira, basically, and then there are other very common names which are Fernando,
Hmm.
Fonseca, which are all sort of
De Silva.
Portuguese derived names, De Silva, yeah, which are all very common names in Sri Lanka. So, or the most common names, to be honest. Um, yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And yeah, it's super interesting because you wouldn't think like if you tell that to someone who doesn't know much about Sri Lanka, they'll be, they're always taken aback when I tell them, we've been colonized for more than 400 years, like close to 500 years. Um, and that kind of answers all those questions, like the questions they ask us, right? Like, why do you speak English so well? Like, probably because we've been colonized for 500 years. Like,
Yeah, I mean, like you literally born and then you learn English. It's almost like you're born with a bilingual brain. Um,
yeah,
Yeah. So I guess the important context is like the end was in 1948 is when Sri Lanka got
yeah,
independence from the British Empire, and it's been circa 70 years of independence. Uh, but from 1948 to 1972, Sri Lanka was still called Ceylon. And then we undertook this new name of Sri Lanka in 1972 when we ratified our new constitution, which is sort of what we broadly operate under today, although there have been like a couple of amendments. And yeah.
yeah, and just to touch on something that just so we give a bit more context, right? We like the history of Sri Lanka goes back to like, like, so like even indigenous like Sri Lankans, like they've been there for like 40,000 years.
and like
Um,
the records, I wouldn't say records, but like the folklore and the stories that are being passed on through generations, I think they predate the birth of Christ, all of that as well.
yeah, I mean they've been in, like there's text like the Mahavansa, Deepavansa and stuff, right? Written in Pali at the time. They have historical records of Sri Lanka. Even in India, there's records of Sri Lanka, and like Ptolemy's map has Sri Lanka in it. So it's a very old country. It's not because it's such a good, as a from a sort of logistical point of view for sort of the shipping trade. It's a very good spot. Um, so it's been a point of interest for a lot of other countries for a long time. So this is probably not the first time we were colonized, um, I guess, but it's been happening through history.
I guess it's important to like distinguish between the difference between colonies such as Australia versus a colony like Sri Lanka, which is something interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I guess so. I think people always tend to think of colonialism in a very similar light, like Australia, Canada, America, and India, Sri Lanka, and all the colonies in the continent of Africa are very different colonies. There are settler colonies, which are Australia, Canada, the United States, and then there are the rest. Often in settler colonies, what you see is because the people who ended up going there were white, were Anglo-Saxon, there was a larger transfer of capital, knowledge, and technology into those countries, which then gave them the foundations for growth. Obviously, in the settler colonies, there were heinous crimes committed against the indigenous peoples of those territories. Um, and that's very much true in sort of the countries that we are from as well, right? So in Sri Lanka as well, the Uwavellassa Kerala, the Uwavellassa rebellion of 1818, which is what Durana slide talked about slightly earlier. Um, there was a sort of local uprising towards British rule, which resulted in allegedly every single male above the age of 18 in Uwavellassa getting murdered as sort of a scorched earth policy to crush the rebellion. Um, and those can't stay, right? But then also the other part, which back to the original point, is that those colonies were viewed as cash cows in a way, right? So you want to take all the resources from India, from Sri Lanka, from Africa, and then send them to the European nations who were the colonial overlords of these countries. And the thing that you see often is some of those resources are still there, right? So like you see statues, like ancient 2,500-year-old statues from Sri Lanka and India in British museums. You see the Queen's crown has like jewels from sort of mines in Sri Lanka, which are very famous for emeralds, very high quality emeralds. So yeah, those colonial vestiges, even like sort of 70, 80 years after the end of colonialism, are still very much visible around the world.
Yeah, I mean, the British Museum it's a joke, really. Like, it's like it's all looted like artifacts. It's 90%. It's all from their colonies, and it makes no sense. You go there, and it's like, if you I haven't been, like, I know my family has, but people who visit that, it's like, well, I'm just looking at my own, like, stuff from my own country. This is like nothing related to the British. Like, it's it's so weird. But yeah,
Yeah.
so it is.
ஆச்சிக்கு முத்து. Yeah,
Is that going in?
I don't know.
More work for you, bro.
There is a very paternalistic attitude even in these museums, right? Because an argument I've often heard is if we return these, whatever it is, like let's say it is a statue, back to Sri Lanka, they'll sort of destroy it and we're going to lose this important part of history. And who the arbiter of that should be is up for dispute, I guess, globally. But my strong view is it's up to the country of origin to decide whether they keep an artifact or not. Lots of things have been lost to sort of the times of sort of like to just time, right? Like as things just like disintegrate. So if someone loses a statue, okay, it's lost, but it's equally lost to the people of that country for it to be sitting in some museum in London where sort of middle-aged white women and men go and look at it and go like, "Oh my God, it's a beautiful statue."
Good accent, mate.
He's just
That's
matching.
good.
He's just matching the energy I put out just now.
This is just going sideways, man.
Yeah.
No,
Again,
that was a
what-
really good point. That was a really good point, though, because I didn't think of it that way. Yeah, you're right. Like, if it's there in a museum in another country, it's kind of lost to the people of that country, right? That is very true.
Yeah, and some people will make the argument, why don't you go and visit that museum, right? But you got to think about this from a logical sense that for the average Australian teenager, it's viable that they'll go on a nice European holiday to find themselves. The average Sri Lankan teenager is not going to the next village. Like they do not have the money to go and visit some museum in London to go and look at sort of some statue, right? So like, yeah, I guess it's
Or
very
Totally,
like
hypothetical.
100%.
the authority, right? Like the passport.
Oh, for sure, yes.
Yeah, so like
Yeah.
that in itself is like another limitation that.
Yeah, we literally like the passport is like it's kind of like blacklisted, right? Like it's so much we gotta go through so many hurdles to just go to a country, whereas here you can just don't even need a visa, just buy your tickets, one way tickets, go and visit. Because I got a lot of mates who are like, we should go, like we should go to Europe. I'm like, I don't think you understand how it works for me. I can't just like go. Like there's so many hurdles I need to go through. Um, and also I was like, because I'm doing my visa stuff, and I just realized that all the white people they're called expats, and then we're called immigrants. Like, what's the difference? Do you know, Tharitha?
So the
Expats versus.
difference, the technical difference, I think, or what I've heard in the past is expats are people who are temporary residents, so they are not here to sort of migrate from whatever their home country is to this country.
Mhm.
But my immigrants are people who are coming here to stay. Although I think that is a very fuzzy sort of bullshit sort of demarcation, which is built to once again sort of show the difference between the whites and the non-whites, right? Or the haves and the
Yeah,
have-nots, perhaps.
yeah, 100%. Because I mean, lots of people come here to work temporarily and go back, um, or study temporarily and go back, and they're not expats; they're immigrants.
Yeah.
um all right, so I think we should touch upon and talk about how um people like us, people who like migrate, look down upon uh our country and like talk bad about it, I guess, like talk about how shitty it is back there, then how like different things are, and how like we've become accommodated to like living in this Western culture, basically. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it because people back in the home country would be like, looking at the migrants being, they've sort of, sold themselves kind of, like they're losing their um, nationality, they're losing their culture. Whereas people who've already migrated looking back at Sri Lanka would be like, everything's like, it's so much better here. Like, why are you still stuck in that, old system, right? Um, and even people within Sri Lanka have that little sort of, I don't know, always places the colonials as an authority figure, um, sort of thinking everything they not like subconsciously, like everything that's foreign is just somehow better inherently, which usually isn't the case.
Yeah, and I find people can often be very cynical about sort of situations which happened back in Sri Lanka or when they were living there, like how bad the politics is, how how bad everything is. Like, the buses are crowded, the roads are sort of people don't follow the road rules all that well, and like all these things, right? Like, so I think I'll give you an example to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. So people often talk about road rules, right? So road rules is a big difference between Sri Lanka and Australia, for example. People don't follow the road rules to the same extent in Sri Lanka that they do in Australia. And that's a common experience, right? So if anyone goes overseas, you'll be able to relate to the fact that the roads are kind of crazy. And people tend to assign this to a moral deficiency. So you often hear people, like even my father and all, like they talk about these as like undisciplined drivers, right? Um, I like to think of it in a slightly different way because it's more an infrastructure challenge to me. When you put that many cars on that small of a road, and then you have this very sort of insufficient level of driver education, you end up in that situation, right? And that's more of a resource constraint than it is really a moral failing. And the best counterexample to this is mask mandates. So if there is actually a sort of level of discipline that sort of the West has above the East or above like these developing countries, you should have seen equivalent adoption of a new concept like mask mandates. But you saw there was a very different sort of reaction to mask mandates here versus mask mandates back home. Like people were far more willing to sort of do things to help the collective public health. Versus here, you could say there's a very ill-disciplined, in a way, approach to that. And if you sort of assign the difference in those two approaches back to the people's moral character, you can end up with the opposite conclusion to what you end up with the drivers, which is probably not true with either, right? It's more like the national sort of psyche is different here. You more freedom, personal rights versus collectivism. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because obviously that we're not genetically different. We're all just humans, so it's wherever you've been born, I guess. But I guess people maybe in developed countries put their individual liberty over most things. Maybe that's why the mask mandates were a bit difficult for them or was challenging. Whereas in developing countries, way more serious, like way more things to worry about than your personal liberty being at risk. You know,
Like expand on the mask mandate and think about like lockdowns and curfew and how much people protest about it compared to like um a different country. Um and like there you see the clear difference as well, and then that's um added points.
yeah.
I think it's people just have more pressing pressing things to worry about. I think your personal liberty and all that stuff is probably down the list of your priorities. There's other things like how am I going to find my next meal, which is probably at the top, right? And I know that might be a reason why with things like this there's more compliance in developing countries.
Yeah, and I guess the broader point is like whatever behavior you see in these countries versus those countries, they're usually not down to sort of a person's difference in character. It's more just about like sort of the circumstances surrounding that system, right, or that incident, right? So like and the inability to see that leads to people being very critical of sort of lots of things back home, um, versus you like I don't think people understand how much easier it is for a politician here to actually write policy versus a Sri Lankan politician. I don't so like when I say this, it's with the caveat that Sri Lankan politicians are immensely corrupt individuals, but
Yeah, agreed.
they also the country does function as well. Like people have buses to go to work, they have trains to go to work. When people speak of the government in Sri Lanka, they speak about the government as like this unspeakably corrupt beast who can't do anything well. But there is a lot they do well, right? So if you think of climate change, for example, Sri Lanka's climate change commitments to the world are far ahead of what Australia are committing. And this is historically Sri Lanka has taken much less from the world in a way because they're a small emitter of sort of fossil fuels, small emitter of greenhouse gases, despite being an equivalent size country to Australia until like very recently. Um, yeah, so you need to sort of my broader point is you need to look at the good as well when you are critiquing the bad. It's sometimes very easy for us because we've come from this worship the West mentality, which was sort of ingrained into us by force, to see everything that's Western as good and everything that's sort of Sri Lankan or local as bad. And that's a very dangerous mentality to live with because you end up sort of regressing towards a monoculture. You lose all sense of national identity. Everyone just speaks English. Everyone dresses the same. Everyone makes the same food. It's all just very boring when there is a lot of individual differences to be celebrated.
Yeah, that was very well put, and like
Very nice.
that was like we came like full circle on the point we started up like half an hour ago, basically. All right, I think. Do you guys remember when back in school, we used to have like religion classes and a religion period per se at the on Friday, end of the week. Everyone's just drained after school, all the trauma basically, and they put in like a religious class. At the
It's
end
the
of the
worst
day,
time. Worst
and
time to put it.
yeah, and they expect people like sit down and listen to a discourse. I'm talking like any religion basically, and
I did.
yeah, Duma did, yeah, and there was a certain section um of students that just decided to say to hell with it, and then they just went to a religion class that was different to their like historical religion. Basically, like the Buddhist students were in the non-RC class, is what I'm getting at. Anyone who listens, who remembers this, will relate to it, I think. Let's talk about that and how that came about to be, and the consequences of what happened when those set of students got caught.
So I guess the story that Dulane is alluding to is when one day two administrators at our school walked into was it the non-RC class? I think we were in the non-RC class, right? The non-RC class, and asked everyone there, um, like, who's not non-RC here, right? So like, who's not a Christian? And like, I would say a majority of the class were not Christian. So for context, it's very easy to know that there are non-Christians in the class, because our grade probably had 300 kids and 80 to 90% of them were Buddhist. So when there are like a good 80 people in the non-RC class, you know that there are some Buddhists in here. And yeah, so sort of the interesting event there is, after they found out that there were a lot of Buddhists here, they went into this tirade about how for years, like the British especially, and the Dutch and the Portuguese before that, have been trying to impose Christianity or Roman Catholicism on Sri Lanka as a nation, and how there's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over the last sort of 500 years or 570 years at that point, to fight against this and protect sort of the local culture surrounding Sinhalese Buddhism. And at that point, like, so, I was a big atheist Andy at this point, so I was like very much against all religion, and I had a sort of very negative reaction to that statement, because I thought it was very insensitive to everyone who was there. And I still do think it was immensely insensitive, but I am starting to slowly see a thread of truth in that statement. And yeah, I just think that's an interesting sort of evolution in how I've been thinking since I actually moved to Australia, to be honest.
Yeah, fair. Because I have this issue that I'm dealing with internally, like has been for a while, which is sort of what that national identity, right? Like, or cultural identity of, because I mean, people are like, yeah, you're Sri Lankan, right? And okay, I am, but then I look into it, and the more back you go through history, it has changed so much. It keeps changing the more back, like the more you go, and in the end, I don't even know who I am, right? And that's with any culture. So I don't know if I'm just, trying to grasp at like straws, right? Like I'm not, I don't know what my identity is. So I've sort of just decided, like going back to sort of, let's say, Stoicism and Seneca, right? Talks a lot about, I think they actually invented the word cosmopolitan, right? A politan of the universe. But that's kind of my mindset now, because I'm trying to think of, what Sri Lanka is, and I can't really think of, like, I don't know what Sri Lanka is, and it's changed so much through time. And what's your thought about that, Tharitha?
Yes, I think I agree broadly with the point that there is no Sinhalese Buddhist or no Sri Lankan sort of singular identity, and anyone who sort of alludes to such an identity usually has an ulterior motive to create sort of an ethno state or something horrible like that. So yeah, I agree with that broad point, but I feel like, so like, if you think of Stoicism, right, like there is a lot of Stoic value in Buddhism as well. Like there is a massive overlap between those two things. But anyways, that's a sort of tangent.
I
I guess
mean,
broad. Sorry.
sorry, I was gonna say, like, there's almost this like revisionist idea that Sri Lanka was some kind of pure singular Buddhist utopia before the white man showed up, which is not true at all.
Yeah.
No, yeah. There's
Yeah,
been
very
so many
complicated history,
kingdoms.
right?
Yeah, it's super
Yeah.
complicated. And any place in history, you just put a point in the map, like point in the map, and then go there. And there's been that it's surviving. Like there's a culture. If there's a culture, that's because there's been lots of wars through history for that culture to survive, right? it's not easy. It's not, this beautiful, cultural utopia, like Dilana said. It hasn't been there, like this eternal culture. It's at some point, this culture that we have now, it's from some invasion, right? So it's not even yours. It's
like
but just
like
been
yeah,
assimilated.
like even now, like most of the culture at the present is like a huge influence that has been from the colonial culture, and like
Yeah.
baila, literally, it's like
My view is every single culture is a product of war, is a product of mixing across different sort of cultures over time. The sort of trying to identify yourself as a singular sort of or trying to assign some level of purity to your Sri Lankan identity is probably a futile task. Um, the way I view it is there is still a difference between myself if I grew up the way I did, which is in Sri Lanka, versus if I grew up here in Australia. Um, and I think that difference should be celebrated because there is a lot of difference, good in that difference. Because as I said earlier, like, if everyone sort of keeps acting for their best economic incentive, right? So their best economic incentive is to speak English, to act white, to be sort of very meek and submissive in these spaces, you'll end up just like losing all of the color on earth because like everything's just going to like converge to the economically dominant culture at the time, which is the US, right? And like you kind of see that in Australia, right? Because there's studies, linguistical studies in Australia, which show that lots of Australian school kids are starting to lose their traditional Australian accents, and they're starting to speak more like the Americans in a lot of their sort of intonation, which I think is a very interesting phenomenon, right? And like is something that can eventually happen across the world. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it spreads very fast now, like faster than you'd think,
yeah,
because of internet and social media and TikTok, right? Like it's happening very fast, and that's true. And even accents, like that's a whole topic. Like
yeah.
us coming here and then dealing with accents, and yeah, maybe that's a topic for another episode.
Yeah, the closing point, I guess one of the closing points is that language, culture are things that people have fought very hard for in the past, especially through colonialism, where there was a massive effort, a deliberate effort to make everyone into a single culture, speak English, play cricket, that's your national sport now, and all of those things, right? But like the thing is, it's really hard to deliberately suppress a culture like that. You can't take a language out of a culture without sort of very high levels of brutal force, which you kind of see in parts of Australia with indigenous communities who have sadly lost their languages, right? Um, but like when a language comes through that, I think it's very important to really language and culture to preserve that language and culture as much as you can, and also try to celebrate it as much as you can, um, but still sort of make sure that you keep fixing yourself as well. Like you don't. Very small line or very thin line between being overly reverential of the flaws of your culture and then being completely like against it and trying to like sort of eliminate it off the face of the earth. Um, yeah,
Yeah, good. Thank you. Because yeah, like I said, I've been trying to wrap my head around what that is, for me personally, and I think that was good. Thank you.
yeah. Um, I think that pretty much brings us to the end of the podcast, right? We spoke about a whole bunch of things, and I think in the end, even though Duma said that we don't know what we're going to talk about, we did like stick to a certain direction, and we got a whole bunch of
Yeah, I think I didn't know. Like, yeah, we didn't have a
yeah,
plan, but I think what we kind of converged to is the idea of a national identity, right? Like what that means and how that's changed through time, in Sri Lanka at least.
yeah.
And it's it's really good to get Tharitha on as well because he obviously knows what he's talking about.
once again,
Yeah,
dangerously high expectations.
we hope he lived up to the expectations that them set at the start of the episode. That just like yeah. So like, thanks again for joining us. It was a great conversation, and yeah, personally, got a lot out of it, and hopefully everyone listening has also been able to relate to it. And yeah, let us know what you think as well. Send in a message. Put it down in any of the comments. Anything. Would love to hear from you as well. Yeah. Boys, I think it's a Saturday evening, so I'll let you guys enjoy that sweet freedom.